Then I took my revolver from under the pillow and fired it into the left side of my chest, aiming for my heart. After that, everything turned into chaos, said the officer. What kind of soldier shoots himself in the chest out of boredom? In 1912, while stationed in the Balkans, an Ottoman officer did exactly that. Not in battle, not in act of bravery, but because he was frustrated and restless. This is the story, tale of an officer who was nothing but a hero. Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode. I am Furkan Arslan, a history master student in Vienna, and today we are diving into the fascinating and unexpected story of an Ottoman officer whose diaries spanning from 1908 to 1924 reveal a very different perspective on military life, duty, and personal struggle from what today's ordinary Turk expects. I came across these diaries in a library collection with my colleague Muhammed Özolca. Thanks to Professor Ethem Eldem's initiative, we dedicated an entire graduate course to translating them at Boğaziçi University last year. Hopefully they'll be published soon. But for now, let's take a journey through these extraordinary writings and discover why this officer is not your typical war hero, but rather an anti-hero in the full sense of the word. First, we will examine the author's youth, followed by his first assignment in the city of Monastir and his experiences there. Then, we will discuss the time he spent in Saloniki, a city he desperately wanted to be posted to, his return to Istanbul due to the Balkan Wars, his role in the Gallipoli campaign during World War I, his duties on Syrian front, and his return to Istanbul once again. Finally, during the national struggle, we will explore his time in Istanbul. The last chronological event we will cover is the author's later years, when he was transferred to Adana and hardships he faced there. Within this chronology, we will talk about protagonist's private life, emotions, habits, and how he tended to react in certain situations. When you put his life on paper chronologically, he might seem like a character that would make a nationalist proud. However, from his diaries, which I believe are uncensored and reveal his inner world, we see that our protagonist is not a hero at all, but perhaps rather an anti-hero in the full sense of the word, a view Professor Eldem once shared. The term anti-hero has been used in literature since the 17th century to describe protagonists who act outside conventional norms. According to the 18th century French writer Jean-Baptiste Racine, an anti-hero has three characteristics. First, he is doomed to lose. Second, he blames everyone but himself for his failures. And third, despite all this, he presents a moral critic of society. The author of these diaries possesses many of these traits. Our protagonist was born in Istanbul in the late 1800s into a middle-class family. Now, being middle-class in Istanbul at that time meant having significant advantages compared to the rest of the empire. Many of individuals mentioned in the diary, his friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, later rose to prominent positions in the Republic of Turkey. The diary offers little about his childhood, but by 1908, we know he was in a school similar to high school. Even then, he showed a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life, a deep-seated laziness. In 1908 alone, he skipped school 101 times, about one-third of the school year. One might wonder whether he had any troubles beside boredom, but in the diary where he poured out his deepest feelings, there is no sign of any other affliction. But the pattern wasn't just laziness. He had a taste for luxury. Instead of shaving himself, he almost always went to barber. He recorded 40 shaves in his diary. 39 of them were at a barber. He loved new clothes, frequently took his old ones to a tailor, and bought new boots several times. He even had his boots polished almost every month. And then there was his most peculiar habit, cinema. In 1908, he went to movies 26 times, statistically once every 2 weeks. One might think that quite an unusual pastime for an Ottoman officer. This kind of lifestyle was not exceptional among military officers of the Russian Empire. Since I haven't came across a detailed study of examining the daily routines and habits of Ottoman officers from that period, it is difficult to determine whether this state was the norm in the Ottoman Empire of the 20th century or an exceptional case. At the very least, we can say that it doesn't quite align with the modern Turkish perception of a military officer. Despite his unimpressive academic record, he managed to complete a reserve officer training and was assigned to Manastır, modern-day Bitola in North Macedonia, in 1911. He hated it. He did everything he could to escape, taking frequent trips to Istanbul or Saloniki whenever possible. He was no hard-working soldier either. Just as he skipped school, he now skipped work. He never even rented a house, preferring to stay in a hotel. Most evenings he was found in bars or music gardens. Eventually he pushed so hard for a transfer that his commander sent him to Saloniki. But was he really qualified for such an important post? Doubtful. The diary reveals something else. His mental state was fragile. At one point, out of boredom or frustration, he shot himself in the chest with his own gun. He survived, but spent a long time recovering in a hospital. While lying on his deathbed in the hospital, caught between life and death, he writes about the air escaping through the hole in his chest as he breathes, and about his temperature that day, yet he doesn't speak of the suicide attempt, as if he wasn't the cause of his own condition. The tune of his writing suggests not someone who has tried to take his life, but someone recovering from an accident, holding on to hope of getting better. Moreover, after recovery, while the world around him was on fire, the Italo-Turkish War had broken out, and battles raged nearby, he paid little attention. Instead, he went shopping, visited a cinema, and lounged in cafes. In fact, he learned Saloniki had fallen to enemy forces while watching a movie. When he finally grasped the seriousness of the situation, his only concern was escaping. To do so, he forged a document claiming he wasn't a soldier and even sold Ottoman military animals to an enemy officer. Eventually, he managed to board a ship and flee to Istanbul. During his time in the Balkans, one name appears most frequently in his diary: Cemil. Cemil was a fellow officer and their bond was far from ordinary. Whenever they fought, the author wrote pages filled with sorrow and longing. A single letter from Cemil could instantly lift his spirit. Their relationship was so intense that one of the main reasons he wanted to be transferred to Saloniki was because Cemil was there. When Cemil visited him, the author moved to a more expensive hotel, and they spent time together in a private room. In one particularly emotional entry, after a fight, he wrote, "I am alone, in tears, in the room where we once stayed together." Interestingly, during this period, he never mentions a woman in a romantic context. Later, he had relationships with females, but none of them were described with the same passion as his bond with Cemil. This deeper connection fades after Cemil got injured in the Battle of Kumonova, and when he reappears years later, the intensity was gone. When World War I erupted, he found himself stationed in some of the most critical battles. In 1915 to 1916, he was at Gallipoli, a campaign still remembered as a defining moment in Turkish history. Yet he never performed a single act of heroism, maybe similar to most of the others. He spent most of the war in rare positions, occasionally drilling soldiers, but mostly drinking with his Armenian friend Agop. His performance at the Saloniki had already shown that courage and leadership weren't his strong suits. Later in 1918, he was assigned to Palestine-Syria front. But once again, instead of fighting, he spent his days visiting luxury cafes and drinking with his friends. Even in one of the most volatile regions of the empire, boredom was his greatest enemy. By 1920, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. Resistance fighters in Anatolia were attempting to secure independence. While people sacrificed everything for the cause, our author sat in Istanbul complaining his diary about his boredom. Many of the days he only wrote alel mutad, ber mutad, alel ade, which are Ottoman Turkish expressions for saying like always. He uses alel mutad for 16 days, alel ade for 15 days, Can sıkıntısı, which means boredom, 18 days. Here is the quotation from one of these days. Bıkkınlık verdi. Dairede can sıkıntısından başka bir şey yok. Meaning, I am utterly fed up. There is nothing but boredom at the office. One might expect him, as a soldier, to join resistance. He didn't. But even if he had, it likely would have been just to escape monotony, not out of patriotism. While the war ended and Republic of Turkey was established in 1923, he faced the consequences of his years of indifference. The new government reassigned him not to Istanbul, which he loved, but to Adana, far from the center of the power. He was furious. He couldn't understand why he wasn't allowed to stay in Istanbul, but the truth was obvious. The leaders of the new republic weren't going to reward a man who had spent the war doing nothing. He also noticed that his peers had risen in rank while he remained stagnant. He wrote in frustration, "I am embarrassed to say my rank now. Why don't they promote me?" So, what do we make of this man? Everything about him, the laziness, the avoidance of duty, the luxury seeking, the cowardice might make him seem pathetic. But in a way, he offers a rare and honest perspective on history. He strips away the myths of heroism and reveals something more real. That not all soldiers were fearless warriors, that not everyone embraced duty with honor, and that in the end, history is filled with ordinary, flawed individuals. Though literature calls such characters anti-heroes, perhaps he was simply human. And if his descendants are still out there, we should thank them. Because by allowing these diaries to survive, they didn't let a fabricated hero emerge. Instead, they preserved the story of a man who lived, stumbled, and struggled in the shadow of an empire's collapse. Thank you for listening. See you next time.